Yo, 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 what is up, YouTube? Today we will be making a Final Fantasy main series tier list. That is the plan for today. It is simple, it is easy, nice, and clean. So it'll take the main series of Final Fantasy and I'll be placing them on a list from S to D, from amazing to legit dog. And to me, none of the Final Fantasy games are legit dog, but today we'll find out exactly where it is in my head that I place these games. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. And we're going to do it in order. So, in my opinion, Final Fantasy 1 sets the standard for the entire series. And that's why I'm going to set it on A. This game just sets the tone for what is the franchise. Honestly, that's all that needs to be said about that one. We're going to move right on to the next one. Where's 2? Final Fantasy 2. I've played it off and on. I've beaten it only once. Out of all the Final Fantasy games, it's the only one I've only played completely through once. So that's why I'm not going to set it as an A, but I will put it as a B. It is good, but it just didn't hook me like the others. Now 3, love 3. 3 was, to me, I loved every bit of 3. There was not a single second where I was just not down for that game. That game was absolutely, to me, almost perfect. There are a couple other series in the Final Fantasies that actually, since there's other ones that I prefer a lot more, maybe put that at a. I'm gonna move that one down to an A. Maybe not an S, but it's S almost. Like it's on the verge of S. And that was Final Fantasy 3. So far we have A tiers as being Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 3, B tiers, Final Fantasy 2. Now, I believe 4 is which one? Where is it? 4 is this one, isn't it? No, 4 is this one. 4, love 4. Actually, no. Change that. 4, it's going up at an S tier. Love the shit out of 4. Don't care. And I'll even put the after one. Actually, I'll put the after on A, but definitely love Final Fantasy 4. It is by far one of the greatest Final Fantasies. You can come at me all you want. That's just what I feel. That game, to me, is the pinnacle of what Final Fantasy is. Now, granted, there are Final Fantasies that I love more. This one just, I replayed the ever-living crap out of that one. Final Fantasy 5. I'm actually going to move Final Fantasy 2 down to a C and Final Fantasy 5 at a B. I liked Final Fantasy 5, but it was lacking some of the things that I thought made a good Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 6. 6 is also going to be a B tier just because the way I look at it is Final Fantasy 1 comes out. Everybody loves the series. Final Fantasy 2 comes out. It's still good, but not like the original. Final Fantasy 3 comes out and it's boom, right there. Boom. Final Fantasy 4 comes out. Boom. Oh, this series is jamming. Final Fantasy 4 after, or AF, comes out, and it's not as good as the original game, but it's right there. Final Fantasy 5 comes out and it's like, oh, they're falling back down. Final Fantasy 6, but they always have that. It's still a good game factor. Like, you love the characters from the series. And then you got the pinnacle of pinnacles, Final Fantasy 7. Hands down, one of my favorite RPGs to ever play. I loved every bit of Final Fantasy 7. There was not a single bit ever. It was actually the first Final Fantasy game that made me replay it on just about everything it was re-released on. Every time. Hands down, love the shit out of that game. There's nothing you can do that could change my mind on that. And then the next one, Final Fantasy 8, just as good. I loved the main characters in Final Fantasy 8 were hands down one of my favorite thing about that game. Everybody in that game had a soul and felt like they belonged in that story. And there's nothing that game did, in my mind, that was trash. Final Fantasy IX comes out. It's good, but it's just not. It's not 8, 7, or 4. It's just not. But it's good. Like, I loved it. But then they released 10. And 10 was just... and then 10-2 with it. Just... Like, as you can tell from this video already, I hands down love the Final Fantasy series. There's not a single second that I've ever hated the series. I love the series so much. This whole arm is covered in Final Fantasy stuff. There's not one second that I just hated the series. There's some times I've looked back and I'm like, not the biggest, but the series always comes out right. I'm trying to find the next one. It'd be this one. Final Fantasy 11 comes out. No, that's not 11. That's 12. Yeah, this is 12. Put 12 back down. Final Fantasy 11, which looks, if I remember, Final Fantasy 11 was the MMO. Yeah, I believe so. And I didn't really play it, so I'm going to put it in the D tier, and I'm going to just... I didn't really play this one. Because at that point, I wasn't into MMOs yet, so I just didn't touch it. Didn't touch that one. And now playing Final Fantasy 14 online, I'm like, wow, I need to go back and touch it. But is it really worth it? Probably. Probably being such a fanboy of this franchise, yes, it's worth it. Theoretically. But then we got Final Fantasy 12. And 12, really good. I'd put it as an A, not an S, but it's good. It's good. And like, being honest, just, I love, like, Final Fantasy 7, 4, 8, 10, 10-2. All great. All great. Love the game. Love them games. And then we got Final Fantasy 13. Actually, no. We had Final Fantasy 12 RW, I believe. Yeah. And I'd put that one as a B. It was good, but it wasn't like, good. And like, we're starting to get into the shaky category of Final Fantasy games. The newer Final Fantasy games, historically, have not done anything that major for the series, aside from Final Fantasy 14. Final Fantasy 14 online, I love that game, I play that game, and will always play that game. Final Fantasy 13 comes out. And I like the characters in the game, but the story's just that of a B. And then here comes Final Fantasy 13-2. Did not like 13-2. Did not. I didn't hate it, but out of all the Final Fantasies, honestly, seeing it next to Final Fantasy 2, I want to move Final Fantasy 2 up and put 13-2 by itself because it's that of trash. But then you have Lightning's Return. And it's not worse than Final Fantasy 13-2. But it's not up here. It's not in the B tier. It's not in the A tier. It's not in the S tier. I almost want to put it in the didn't play tier, but I can't. And Final Fantasy 14, hands down, one of my favorite MMOs, favorite Final Fantasy series, that behind 7, well, behind all the main series. But I love every expansion Final Fantasy 14 introduces, every patch Granted, sometimes they nerf things unplanned, but it's part of the MMO balance. Can't really do much about that. And then we have Final Fantasy 15. And let's no, I played it. Put this down. Okay, it's not going to go down. I 100% played this game. And I saw how people reviewed it. And people would have it at like a B or a C. I absolutely think this is an A tier game. I think Final Fantasy 15, hands down, is an A tier game. And let me specify this. I legit cried in this game. This game is one of the newer Final Fantasies that can do that. Older ones, hands down, did that as well. Easily, superbly, perfectly. But 15 was not bad. I would put 15 at an A. Now, I wish I could add another one. Okay, I'm messing things up. I really did just mess things up. Okay, fixed it. I really was just messing things up. I almost want to put Final Fantasy 1 as an S, which I think I'm going to do. Final Fantasy 1 and 3 to me are S tiers. They're A plus tiers. But actually, yeah, I'm going to make an A plus tier. A plus. These two alone get to sit in A plus tier. This is my Final Fantasy tier list. And I welcome you to use this template. I did not create it. I will give credit to who made it I'll put it in the description below. But I welcome you to show me what your tier list looks like. But right now, we're going to explain. In the S tier, we have Final Fantasy 7. Doesn't need an explanation. 4. No explanation needed. Every game in this tier has no explanation. 8, 10, 10-2, 14 online. Them are all hands down S tier to me. There's nothing you can say against that. But let's move on to the A plus tier. A plus tier, 1, the original. 3, the one that brings Final Fantasy back to its roots to me. And then Final Fantasy 12. 12 was not the best, but it was good. And then we have Final Fantasy 4 AF. Was a good one, but it lacks some of the bones. And then we have Final Fantasy 9. Final Fantasy 9 saw some added characters, really brought some things to the story, but didn't change a whole lot. But it didn't have to. Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15 finally brings Final Fantasy back to where I want it to be, with 13 kind of messing up the series and only leaving 14 for people to want to play. 15 came out, and it gave every Final Fantasy fan a breath of wind. Whether you hate the series or not, it was a good game. The story was solid, and you could get into that story and have no problem. In the B tier, we have 5, 6, 12 RW, 13, and 2. I personally didn't care too much for some of these. Like, I liked 5, liked 6, didn't care for RW, 12 RW, didn't really care. 13, I liked. The characters were interesting. And then Final Fantasy 2, I just couldn't get into it like the first or the third. Just couldn't. But that is what it is. And then we come down to the C tier. We have what I consider the ones that I would not recommend Final Fantasy or anybody wanting to get into Final Fantasy, these games. 13.2 and 13.3. These games did no good things for Final Fantasy. Really didn't. If anything, it kind of hinders Final Fantasy. I like Final Fantasy, and I can sit here and say I've played through them. I hear you. But they were lacking. Final Fantasy had lost sight on what it was when it released them games. And then on the D tier, or the didn't play, it was Final Fantasy 11 Online. I just didn't play it at the time. I would think it'd be a good game, but I just didn't play it. And that's that. But now that we're done with the tier list, I'm going to make an announcement here. Coming soon, all these Final Fantasy games you just saw, I will be replaying them. I will be replaying them. Every single one. But there's going to be a twist. They're all going to be done in order. So it's going to be 1 through all the main series ones that are not MMOs. It's going to be 1 through 13.3. Excluding 14. Actually, no, it'd be 1 through 15. Excluding 14 and 11. I will play every one of those series. But we're going to add a challenge to it. If I die one time during the story, I restart whatever game I was on. So if I'm playing Final Fantasy 13-1 or Final Fantasy 13 and I'm at the end of the story and I die to a boss, completely resets. I reset that whole game. And this is definitely going to be a challenge that'll take some time, but it adds a risk factor to it. And that will be a new series that will be coming within the month. I also have a new series that I will be streaming on Twitch, twitch.tv at MogXXI. I will have a new League of Legends series that I will be recording, but it will be mostly streamed. I'll tell you more about it this Friday. But them are all the big things I have going on. That's my tier list. That's my new series on YouTube. And that's my new series on Twitch. If you liked the video, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. And be sure to let me know. What was your favorite Final Fantasy game? Is it the same as mine? Is it not? I don't know. You tell me. But further ado, keep it easy, peace, and have a good day.